As the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the packed courtroom, Thomas Grayson sat rigid in the defendant's chair. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the wooden armrests, his years of police training doing little to calm his racing heart. The murmurs in the room faded into an oppressive silence as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on the man accused of murder. Judge Martinez's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a man in his 60s with deep worry lines etched into his forehead, cleared his throat. "We have, Your Honor." His hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. Thomas's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He glanced at his attorney, James Bennett, who refused to meet his gaze. Across the aisle, District Attorney Peterson wore a slight, victorious smirk. In the back row, Sarah Mitchell, his former partner, sat motionless, her expression unreadable. He had trusted her for years, yet now she was nothing more than a distant stranger. The foreman inhaled sharply. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." The words hit Thomas like a sledgehammer. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of disbelief. His mind reeled as his entire world collapsed around him. "The jury recommends death by lethal injection," the foreman continued, his voice cracking slightly. Thomas clenched his jaw. The evidence against him had been damning. Gunshot residue on his hands, grainy surveillance footage, a witness swearing they saw him. It was too perfect, too clean. But he knew the truth. He hadn't killed Daniel West. As the bailiffs approached with handcuffs, his life felt like lead. He caught Sarah's eye, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw it. Doubt, regret, but it was gone in an instant. Outside the courthouse, Atlas waited with his temporary handler. The German Shepherd's ears perked up as the heavy doors opened. The moment he saw Thomas in shackles, he barked furiously, pulling against his leash with such force that the handler stumbled. "Easy, boy," the man muttered, struggling to hold him back. Atlas's frantic barks echoed down the courthouse steps as Thomas was led into the transport van. He knew something was wrong. He could sense it, but Thomas didn't look back. He couldn't. The doors slammed shut, sealing his fate. As the heavy courthouse doors swung open, a gust of cold air swept through the entrance, stirring the crowd gathered on the steps. The reporters whispered among themselves, cameras flashing as the shackled figure of Thomas Grayson emerged between two officers. But amid the sea of faces, only one pair of eyes truly understood the gravity of the moment: Atlas's. The German Shepherd stood rigid beside his temporary handler, his muscles coiled like a steel spring. His deep brown eyes locked onto Thomas, his ears twitching at the clinking of chains around his master's wrists. He had spent years by Thomas's side, trained to detect danger before it struck. And now, something was wrong. The moment Thomas stepped into view, Atlas lunged forward with an intensity that caught his handler off guard. The leash jerked violently as the dog barked, loud and desperate, his warning cries slicing through the murmur of the crowd. "Whoa, easy there!" The handler muttered, tightening his grip. But Atlas wasn't listening. His instincts roared louder than any command. His master was in danger. He could feel it in his bones. Inside the transport van, Thomas turned his head just in time to see Atlas straining against the leash, his powerful body trembling with urgency. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting second, an unspoken message passed between them. Atlas knew. He knew Thomas was innocent. Then, the van doors slammed shut with a deafening clang. Atlas let out a howl that sent a chill down the spine of everyone present. It wasn't just a bark. It was a cry of protest, of desperation, of truth unheard. The reporters fell silent, exchanging uneasy glances, while Atlas dug his claws into the pavement, refusing to move. Something was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. Sarah Mitchell wasn't supposed to get involved. That was what she kept telling herself as she tossed the set of keys onto her kitchen counter and glanced at the restless figure pacing near the door. Atlas had barely touched his food. His water bowl sat nearly full. Instead of settling down, the German Shepherd moved anxiously back and forth, his nails clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Every few minutes, he would stop, ears perked, and stare at the door as if expecting someone to walk through it. But Thomas wasn't coming home. Sarah exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. She had agreed to take care of Atlas temporarily, just until arrangements could be made. But the dog's behavior gnawed at her. She had seen working dogs struggle with the loss of their handlers before, but this was different. This wasn't grief. This was something else entirely. Late that night, just as she was dozing off on the couch, a sharp, low growl jolted her awake. Atlas was standing near the window now, his entire body tense, ears straining towards something beyond the glass. Then, without warning, he let out a sharp bark and darted toward the door, pawing at it urgently. Sarah sat up, heart pounding. "Atlas, what is it?" The dog whined, his tail low, pacing back to her before returning to the door. He was trying to tell her something. Something inside her gut twisted. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her jacket and the leash. All right, let's see what's got you so worked up." The moment she clipped the leash onto his collar, Atlas yanked forward with a force that nearly sent her stumbling. He wasn't just looking for a walk. He had a destination. And Sarah had a sinking feeling she needed to see where it led. Sarah had followed Atlas before on routine patrols, but this was different. The German Shepherd wasn't just sniffing out an old scent. He was leading her with a purpose, moving through the darkened streets with unshakable determination. His pace quickened as they neared the docks, his powerful muscles tensed beneath his thick coat. The industrial waterfront was eerily quiet at this hour. The air was thick with the salty tang of the bay, mixed with the faint metallic scent of rusting machinery. Sarah shivered as a cold breeze whipped through the empty alleyways. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find, but the knot in her stomach told her that Atlas knew exactly where he was going. Then he stopped. Right at the base of a massive, rusted shipping container, Atlas began circling, his nose to the ground, sniffing furiously. His ears twitched, and then he started digging. Sarah's pulse spiked. She crouched down beside him, brushing aside loose dirt and debris. That was when she saw it. A small, charred piece of fabric wedged between the rocks. She picked it up carefully, her fingers running over the material. It was thick, sturdy, tactical. A shiver ran down her spine. She knew this fabric. It was the same industrial-grade weave used in police tactical gear. But Thomas hadn't been wearing his tactical uniform that night. Her throat tightened. If this fabric belonged to someone else, then that meant Atlas let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the shipping containers. Sarah followed his gaze, suddenly feeling like she wasn't alone. Gripping the evidence tightly, she whispered, "What the hell have we just found?" Sarah didn't waste any time. She raced back to her apartment, her mind reeling as she spread out the crime scene photos and the burnt fabric scrap across her kitchen table. Atlas paced beside her, his nails clicking anxiously against the floor. The weight of what she had just discovered pressed heavily against her chest. The fabric wasn't just a random piece of cloth, it was evidence. And if her instincts were right, it proved that someone else had been at that crime scene, someone wearing police tactical gear. But Thomas's gear had never been logged as evidence, which meant someone had planted everything to frame him. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She had to be careful. If Thomas was being set up, it meant powerful people were involved, people who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. Scrolling through her contacts, her eyes landed on a familiar name, Luis Vega. He was a former informant, a man who had once been deep in the city's underbelly before turning his life around. More importantly, he had once worked for Daniel West, the very journalist who had been murdered, the murder that Thomas had been convicted of. She hesitated for only a moment before pressing the call button. "Mitchell?" Vega's voice was low, wary. "I need information," she said, her voice steady. "About Daniel West, about who he was investigating before he died." A long silence stretched between them. "You don't want to go down this road, Detective," Vega finally muttered. "West was onto something big, the kind of thing that gets people killed." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. "Thomas Grayson is on death row for a crime he didn't commit. If I don't go down this road, he dies." Another pause. Then, finally, Vega let out a sharp breath. "There's a name you need to look into. Michael Holloway." Sarah's blood ran cold. Deputy Chief Michael Holloway, a man with an untouchable reputation, a decorated officer, and the last person anyone would suspect of being involved in something dirty. Her stomach twisted. If Holloway was behind this, then the corruption ran deeper than she'd ever imagined. And if that were true, Thomas wasn't just an innocent man on death row. He was a loose end. Sarah swallowed hard. Time was running out, and now she wasn't just racing against a legal system that had already failed Thomas. She was racing against the kind of enemy who made sure their mistakes disappeared. Permanently. The walls of Thomas Grayson's prison cell felt like they were closing in on him. He had spent weeks in this hellhole, counting the days until his execution, but something had shifted in the last 24 hours. The guards were watching him differently. Their glances lingered a little too long, their silence heavier than before. Something was coming. That night, the usual hum of the prison was off. The other inmates seemed restless, their murmurs hushed. Thomas lay on his cot, eyes open, muscles tense. His instincts screamed at him to stay alert. Then he heard it. Footsteps. More than one pair, moving with purpose. The shuffle of boots against concrete, stopping right outside his cell. The metal door groaned as it slid open. Before Thomas could react, 3 figures lunged at him. The first blow came fast, a brutal punch to the ribs that knocked the air from his lungs. He barely had time to roll before another inmate grabbed his shirt, yanking him off the cot and slamming him against the cold, hard wall. His head snapped back, stars exploding in his vision. "Stay down, cop," one of them sneered, his breath rank with cigarettes and sweat. But Thomas wasn't built to stay down. Using the wall for leverage, he threw an elbow into the closest man's jaw, sending him reeling. The second attacker lunged, but Thomas twisted just in time, catching the man's wrist and forcing him forward, using his own momentum to send him crashing to the floor. Then came the sharp sting of a blade slicing across his arm, a makeshift shiv, crude but deadly. Thomas clenched his teeth against the pain, adrenaline dulling the wound as he dodged another attack. But the numbers weren't in his favor. The third man tackled him, pinning him down as the first attacker raised the shiv again, aiming for something vital. Just as the blade came down, a voice bellowed from the hallway. "Enough!" The chaos froze. The attackers hesitated, then backed away. Officer Green stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He was one of the senior guards, one of the few who had been watching Thomas closely. Green tilted his head, eyes flicking over Thomas's battered form. "Looks like you've made some enemies, Grayson." Thomas wiped the blood from his lip, forcing himself to stand. "Looks like someone wants me dead before the state gets the chance." Green smirked, but there was no humor in it. Welcome to death row. As the attackers shuffled out of the cell, Thomas realized something with chilling certainty. This wasn't just a prison fight. This was a warning. Whoever had framed him wasn't willing to wait for lethal injection. They wanted him gone now. Sarah Mitchell gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The industrial district was nearly abandoned at this hour, the skeletal remains of old warehouses casting long, eerie shadows under the dim streetlights. Atlas sat rigid in the passenger seat, ears perked, body tense. He knew. Just like before, he sensed something was coming. Sarah parked a block away, her breath shallow as she reached for her gun. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just another case. This was about stopping a man who had corrupted everything she once believed in. A man who had framed an innocent officer and nearly gotten away with it. Michael Holloway. She moved quickly, keeping to the shadows as she approached the warehouse entrance. The massive metal door was slightly ajar, and inside, dim lights flickered over rusted machinery and stacks of wooden crates. A voice echoed from the far end of the warehouse. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Sarah froze. Then, slowly, she stepped into the open, gun raised. Michael Holloway stood near a makeshift office, his polished shoes a stark contrast to the grimy floor beneath them. He wasn't alone. 2 armed men flanked him, their fingers twitching near their holsters. Holloway smirked. "I knew someone would come sniffing around eventually. Just didn't think it'd be you." Sarah kept her stance firm. "You framed Thomas Grayson. You killed Daniel West. It's over, Holloway." Holloway chuckled, shaking his head. "Over? Oh, Sarah, you think you can just waltz in here, point a gun at me, and make this all go away? You have no idea how deep this goes." Before she could respond, Atlas let out a deep guttural growl. Then, chaos. One of Holloway's men reached for his gun, but Atlas was faster. The German Shepherd lunged, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's wrist, forcing him to drop his weapon with a scream. Sarah fired at the second man, her shot grazing his shoulder, sending him spinning into a stack of crates. Holloway, ever the coward, made a break for it. Sarah sprinted after him, her heart pounding. He shoved through a back door, emerging into an alley where an idling black SUV waited. But before he could reach it, Thomas Grayson stepped out of the shadows. His face was battered, his prison uniform torn, but his eyes burned with something Holloway hadn't expected. Fury. "Going somewhere?" Thomas growled. Holloway hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Sarah tackled him from behind, slamming him onto the pavement. The gun skidded from his grip as she pressed her knee into his back, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. "You're done," she spat. Holloway gritted his teeth, his face twisted in rage. "You think this ends with me?" he hissed. "There are bigger players in this game than you could ever imagine." Sarah ignored him. Sirens wailed in the distance. Reinforcements were coming. Atlas trotted over, his tongue lolling, his mission complete. Thomas exhaled, exhaustion sinking into his bones. He looked down at the man who had stolen everything from him and let out a breath that felt like freedom. For the first time in a long time, justice had finally won. In the end, this wasn't just a story about justice. It was about loyalty, trust, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Atlas wasn't just a police dog. He was a guardian, a protector, and a silent voice for the truth when no one else would listen. His instincts, his unwavering dedication, and his deep connection to Thomas saved a life, proving that sometimes our greatest allies come in forms we least expect. Animals, like Atlas, are more than just companions. They are intelligent, intuitive, and capable of extraordinary acts of love and bravery. They don't judge, they don't betray, they simply stand by those they trust. Yet too often, animals are abandoned, mistreated, or overlooked, their value underestimated in a world that moves too fast to truly see them. This story serves as a reminder. We must do better. We must protect and cherish the creatures that share our world, whether they are loyal dogs, majestic wildlife, or the delicate ecosystems that sustain us all. In loving and respecting them, we not only honor their place in our lives, but also rediscover our own humanity. Because in the end, true justice isn't just about people. It's about kindness in every form it takes.